Most spiritual successors don't fail because they misunderstand old games. They fail because they misunderstand why people love them in the first place. They copy mechanics, they copy systems, they copy presentation. But classic games aren't just systems. They're products of a time, of technological limits, of player expectations that may have changed over the intervening years. What people really miss isn't just how those games worked, it's how they felt. And after playing the Parasite Mutant demo, I'm worried it might be falling into that exact trap. Hey, by the way, this is Nick BRPG. If you enjoy thoughtful RPG analysis, video essays, reviews, power and systems discussions, and much more, consider giving me a like and a sub. RPG discourse is my bread and butter, and your support helps me out a ton. Also, by quick way of disclaimer, this video is not so much a review of the recently dropped Parasite Mutant demo, so much as it's using Parasite Mutant and others, as you'll see later, to discuss spiritual successors more broadly. What they are, why we want them, and where they so often fail. If you're looking for a proper review of Parasite Mutant, I think this video will still serve that purpose. And yes, I understand I'm making a lot of extrapolations based on a merely 40-minute long demo impression, but we can only work with what we've got. And I believe here, there's a lot to be discussed. Let's dive further. And we start by looking at Parasite Eve, the very clear inspiration of Parasite Mutant. 1998 was a different time in gaming. 3D games were new and still on the frontier of gaming. Virtually everything was fresh. Everything was a risk. Nearly every new PlayStation game felt like a full swing for the fences, like an attempt at making something new. And even in that environment, Parasite Eve was still an outlier in what it was, what it stood for, and what it was trying to accomplish. Squaresoft, this was before the merge with Enix, was a JRPG juggernaut, already famous by that point following the success of Final Fantasy VII and the Final Fantasy series more broadly. Then, seemingly out of nowhere at the time, they decided to foray into a sci-fi horror genre taking place in real New York City. This felt fresh, and 11-year-old me, terrified as I was every time a monster creepily mutated in that game, was there for it. If this brief history lesson about the moment around Parasite Eve seems erroneous or boring, please understand that this is exactly what I was talking about in the intro of this video. Games do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in a living, breathing world. Our world. And merely understanding what a game is will not help you understand what a game was, what it did, and the feelings it invoked in its heyday. The monsters were generally creepy, ammo for your guns was a limited resource, and the general tone and vibes gave it a survival horror feel, while Square's more signature RPG elements, including leveling up, attribute points, gearing options through menus, all shone through to make the game feel wholly unique and like it wasn't only blending genres narratively, but like it was blending genres mechanically too. It was different, unique, not without its flaws, but fun. And again, unlike anything else you've ever played, capped with, among other things that are better not spoiled, an S-tier soundtrack composed by Yoko Shimomura and an insanely powerful and gripping opening scene that will hook the player almost immediately. I'm not going to be the one to tell you that Parasite Eve, like so many games in the infancy of 3D gaming, was without certain stiffness, jank, long loading times, and many other pitfalls of the limitations of the time, but it had an unimpeachable mark of quality about it. This game style was not only fresh at the time, but it's wildly underrepresented now, nearly 30 years later. Parasite Eve worked not because of its mechanics, but because of how it felt. Unfamiliar, tense, uncanny, grounded, and experimental. This brings us to Parasite Mutant, a new indie demo that aims to be the Parasite Eve revival fans have been begging for. I'd offer a bigger explanation of this game's premise if I could, but the demo was extraordinarily story-light, instead focusing on a fairly thin slice of combat and exploration. but what I can glean based on the broad context clues of the demo is that there is some sort of outbreak of freaky mutant creatures running among the streets, and a compound where your character, Nova, comes to her senses, arms herself with a blade, and begins to clear the compound and ascertain her surroundings. She's clearly a combat-trained agent of some kind and is on a mission to deal with this mutant threat. Otherwise, it's just rainy, desolate, sci-fi horror vibes. And to be clear, for the slice of gameplay that I was able to engage with, they hit the nail on the head. This was excellent. Mere minutes into the game, you can detect Parasite Eve's DNA on every surface and in every crack of Parasite Mutant's structure. From sharing half of the same title name, to piloting a pretty blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman as your protagonist, to combat and gameplay systems that feel closer to identical than they do merely similar. I don't principally think this is necessarily a bad design choice, but I do think mirroring Parasite Eve this closely, paradoxically, comes with both benefits and risks by turns. Let's look more closely at some of Parasite Mutant's gameplay elements to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Let's start with what worked, and we can start with Parasite Mutant's art and presentation style. I thought it was a really neat touch that they give 2 additional graphic settings in addition to default at the start of the game, which can later be accessed in the menus, that allow you to mimic the graphical gritty/fuzzy style of games from the 90s or aughts, one for each era respectively, or again just maintain its more modern, high-quality look. I don't really know how many players will care to use this option, but it's cute and doesn't hurt anything that it exists. Options in this vein are generally welcome. The devs are saying, if you want this game to look like Parasite Eve, here's your option. But if you want it to look more modern, feel free to ignore. And I, as a retro gamer of yesteryear who came up in the 80s and 90s and for whom most of his favorite games took place in the 90s, naturally chose the modern graphics. Yeah, when I said in my intro that I like callbacks to classical games to play more like how we remember them, more than I need them to necessarily imitate them, this is a perfect example of what I mean. I also like the combat, which might as well be called a carbon copy of Parasite Eve's combat. This might sound like I'm bashing it, but this combat system is so underexplored that I think copying this particular element is a good thing. Sure, it might feel safe and uninspired to this closely mimic Parasite Eve's gameplay, but even a close facsimile of the old system feels new here, and will be new to any player who never played Parasite Eve, which will be a fair few number of players, I imagine. Lastly, I like this game's vibe. The opening cinematic is brief but solid, and I think it was a nice touch to throw you right into what looks like a mission gone very wrong. If this is the intro to the game, it doesn't hold a candle to Parasite Eve's level, but that's fine, and I digress. The vibes here are tense, spooky, and the relentless rainfall washes the area into a white, noisy, yet somehow disquieting sense of stillness. You guessed it. This game also matches Parasite Eve's vibes, and it's all the better for having done so. Vibes are not strictly tangible on their face, and JRPGs that aim to be sci-fi spooky and unnerving are, much like the combat system as we've discussed earlier, quite undersaturated in the market. For those reasons, I think this was a good call directionally. But as I said earlier, while there are some areas where closely mimicking Parasite Eve's design plays to Parasite Mutant's advantage, we will now discuss the areas where I think this mimicry had played to its disadvantage. First, there was the bizarrely long load times, and this might sound crazy, but Parasite Eve had long load times too, as many PS1 games of the time did, and it just makes me wonder here if this is somehow an intentional touch. Sounds strange, but I don't understand why a game like this would load so slowly otherwise. While the game's pretty and I really do like its art style personally, the game's graphics aren't particularly high fidelity, and the play scenario wasn't that big or asset dense either. So if these very long load times really are an optimization issue and not a conscious effort to mimic the long load times of original PlayStation games, like Parasite Eve, well, that's a different problem. but a problem all the same. Sure, long load times feels retro, but this is one vestige of yesteryear that I do not think many of us miss. And speaking of vestiges of yesteryear that at least I don't miss, Parasite Mutant also chose to bring back Parasite Eve's random encounters. And before anyone says, okay Zoomer, look, I'm a retro gamer. Been playing JRPGs since the 80s. Xenogears is my favorite game of all time, and it has random encounters. I'm experienced here, I get where they came from, and all the same, I declare, on-screen avoidable encounters are strictly superior to random encounters. And I think the trajectory of modern game design largely backs up that claim. Fight me, I'll die on that hill. Back on track, I assume this was a conscious design choice to call back to Parasite Eve, but this one was, to me, a missed opportunity. Taking Parasite Eve's combat mechanics and bringing them to the modern avoidable encounter format would have been the perfect way to preserve the most unique and missed aspects of the old combat system while pushing it forward to the modern era and modern audiences. Especially because the random encounters, in my very narrow play experience with this demo, can happen in really unfortunate areas. Twice I was attacked on this very narrow catwalk, and the layout of the area completely prevents a big part of the game's combat mechanic in moving and spacing to avoid enemy attacks. In these fights, you were forced to face tank hits because you got unlucky and fished a random encounter in a really bad spot. And yeah, Parasite Eve absolutely had this same problem in certain areas. It was weak design then, and it feels like a design mistake now. Again, this is where modern design sensibilities can take a good but flawed thing of the past and fix that flaw to elevate it to even greater heights in the present, rather than copying the flaws within that old system. Further, it was unclear in Parasite Mutant which areas had random encounters and which do not, and at least for me, it made exploration feel a little stiff, bordering on punishing. They also seem to have borrowed many notes from Parasite Eve's exploration, with fixed camera angles that only change or move when you move to certain areas on any given area of the map. For my money, this is another area where I think modernizing the formula, while risky, may have played to Parasite Mutant's advantage. Frankly, exploration was a little janky in Parasite Eve, and while Parasite Mutant's map does a pretty good job showing you POIs, boxes, and breakable objects, the problem is that it's a menu map, so to fully utilize it, you need to interrupt gameplay to look at the full screen map. It's an immersion-breaking loop, and loops like that are extra painful in games like this, where atmosphere, immersion, and tension are everything. I'm glad that they tried to modernize Parasite Eve's janky and often opaque exploration, but the solution here seems to have created a different problem. For my money, either a mini-map with the same icons on it, or just clearer visual cues for interactable objects would have gone a really long way for modernizing the game away from a flaw of its inspiration. Again, a missed opportunity. What all of this principally reveals about spiritual successors is that what works, or how closely you should copy from the original inspiration, is not a one-size-fits-all formula. While sheer quality is always a crucial factor in a game's success, as I've said in my intro, a game's impact also hinges on the context of the variables that surround the game. So even if many elements look virtually copied from Parasite Eve, and frankly, they do, Parasite Mutant gets a lot of free leeway just in the fact of how undersaturated the current market is for games like this. We're standing on really fertile ground here. I mentioned the risks of this close copying approach earlier in this video essay, and I want to drill down on that further here. Let's think of spiritual successors as a spectrum. On the low end of the spectrum, a game might take influence, even fairly direct influence, from a game or games, while still clearly possessing its own identity and systems. I think Chained Echoes would be a good example of an indie RPG that fits this bucket, showing clear inspirations from Final Fantasy VI, Xenogears, Suikoden, and Chrono Trigger. Maybe it helps that it is borrowing ideas from many different games, but I think the primary reason Chained Echoes is so often considered to be the gold standard for great indie games or spiritual successors in the RPG community, and this is an opinion I share, is because while its inspirations are worn on its sleeve, it still finds its own identity and leads with its own ideas and systems. This makes the elements that are callbacks to beloved games of yesteryear feel like just that, callbacks, but never cheap imitations. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, you have a game like Eiyuden Chronicle, the very highly anticipated Suikoden spiritual successor, fall more flat. And I think a big part of the blunder, at least for me, is that it was trying too hard at virtually every turn to be Suikoden, rather than to be its own thing that merely borrowed elements from Suikoden. I've heard people call the villain Dukes Aldrich, Timu Luca Blight funny, and I agree. And I've heard others call Eiyuden Chronicle itself Timu Suikoden, a little more harsh and maybe debatable. The point is, when you're trying to fill really big shoes and you're trying to do it as faithfully as you possibly can, and that's exactly what it looks like Parasite Mutant is trying to do, it falls dangerously close to the Eiyuden Chronicle end of this spectrum, where the efforts to recapitulate the mood, vibe, feeling, and nostalgia of a golden age great look less like a nod, less like modern day advancement, and more like a cheap imitation that can't quite capture the spirit and feeling of the original classic. I dare not decisively declare that this is the crash course of Parasite Mutant merely for having experienced a 40-minute demo of it, but I do declare that, based on what I've experienced, the design philosophy behind this game seems to be a question of how can we make this game play as much like Parasite Eve as humanly possible, rather than how can we borrow the best elements of Parasite Eve's combat and setting, make it our own, and elevate it to a modern standard and capture a similar feeling of Parasite Eve. And if I'm right in that vein, then that's a dangerous pitfall indeed. Parasite Mutant captures a lot of the same jank of Parasite Eve, but there's a difference between jank born of an at-the-time system limitation and jank born of a modern imitation of an old classic that demonstrates an all-too-common failure to understand that when many of us old-timers say we want to see echoes of the golden age in gaming, indeed, we want to see more games like this. What we're asking for is for games to play like how we remember them, more so than asking to copy them beat for beat, flaws and all. We're not asking to replicate the old classics technically. We're asking to recreate a feeling the classic gave us. Parasite Eve's flaws can mostly be appropriately chalked up to systemic limitations of the time when it was made. As such, they're weirdly charming. Parasite Mutant's copying those flaws won't be received as charitably, and nor should it be. I want to wrap up this video on a warmer note. I am definitely not saying spiritual successors are fundamentally bad. When it comes down to it, I love spiritual successors. I'm as fully hyped and excited as anyone that Threads of Time is in production and promises another attempt at capturing that Chrono Trigger feeling. Like a moth to a flame, there's absolutely no way I can resist that siren song. I do believe, as a retro gamer myself, that there are design elements, soul, and charm that have been left behind in the era of yesteryear. So I have nothing but respect for studios, including Ice Citruna here, for braving the gauntlet and trying to bring back some of that magic. I threw a lot of sharp elbows in this video, but I cannot stress strongly enough that for me, it comes from a place of love. Despite all of these criticisms, I really enjoyed the demo, and this is going to be a day one purchase for me. I have to see this through, with my sincerest hope for this game's success. I love Parasite Eve, and I love that an indie studio is trying this hard to revive that spirit and deliver a style of game that absolutely deserves a more prominent spot in the RPG zeitgeist. I want this game to succeed, and I want to eat crow years from now when it turns out I was worrying in this video over nothing. I hope that the next time I talk about Parasite Mutant, it's to tell you guys how this game is the case study of a spiritual successor done right. I want to tell you that I was completely blown away by it. But if nothing else, I miss Parasite Eve, and I love what Parasite Mutant is trying to do in recapturing that magic. That alone is a cause worth celebrating. That's all I got for today, friends. This is Nick B. RPG. Here I discuss all things RPG with turn-based and JRPGs being my absolute favorite. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.